Have you ever had something happen in your life that seemed like a coincidence at the time, but later made you wonder, wait a minute, was that actually a sign? That's exactly what happened to me. I went to Newmarket, St Elizabeth, as a volunteer for the final day of the Blues Boy Foundation giveaway. I went there to help distribute clothes, shoes, books and other blessings to the community. But I ended up receiving something myself, a book, and not just any book. The strange thing is, 2 years earlier, during a period when I was doing what I understood to be automatic writing, I heard the words, "You are an alchemist." At the time, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. Then 2 years later, that exact word appeared in a book sitting among hundreds of other books at a charity giveaway. And that's where the story gets really interesting. Because while that book sent me on a journey of discovering purpose, transformation, and what it means to become the person we are meant to be, something else happened at that same giveaway that left me disappointed. Someone stole a woman's brand new crocs at an event where people were being given shoes and clothing for free. And strangely enough, even that incident became part of the lesson. So today I'm taking you with me from Bethel Town to Newmarket, from a charity giveaway to a book called The Alchemist, and from stolen shoes to a deeper lesson about who we are becoming. Because perhaps the greatest alchemy isn't turning metal into gold. Perhaps it's turning our experiences into wisdom, our pain into growth, and what we have into a blessing for someone else. So grab yourself a drink, settle in, and let's talk about it.
Shining bright, the beach is calling out my name. The waves are crashing gently, and the breeze is blowing through my hair. Summer vibe, it's so right. The feeling of freedom in the air. Days are long and lazy, and the nights are filled with music and fun. The palm touch.
It was the final day of the Blues Boy Foundation giveaway, and this time the charity was taking the blessings a little further afield, to Newmarket in St Elizabeth. There was a whole team of us from the Bethel Town community, young and not so young, all pulling together to make it another great day. The organisers had made one thing very clear: this giveaway was for the people of that community. Anything that was left over would stay right there in Newmarket. So early in the morning we boarded the bus and headed out. When we arrived, the tables were set up inside the church rather than outdoors. The truck was unloaded and everyone simply got on with what needed to be done. There was no big meeting, no complicated instructions. We somehow just naturally assigned ourselves to different areas and got to work. I started out helping to unload the books, and that's when it happened. Among all those books, one particular book caught my eye. Now, before I tell you what the book was, let me take you back a little, because I believe some things happen in our lives that look like coincidence, but when you start looking back, you realise there was a thread running through it all. I have shared before how I was inspired by the author Neil Donald Walsh, who wrote Conversations with God. His story fascinated me because he described receiving what he understood to be downloads from God through a process known as automatic writing. Well, I was intrigued, so I had a little conversation with God myself. I reminded him that he's no respecter of persons, and I basically said, well, Lord, if you gave him that gift, I'd quite like some of it too. And I did what Neil Donald Walsh did, minus the anger. I picked up a pen, put it to paper, connected with God, and said, Speak, Lord, I'm listening, and started writing whatever flowed into my mind. And I kept writing, notebook after notebook. Sometimes words would come to me that I wasn't even familiar with. I'd have to stop and look them up because I wanted to understand what I was writing. And that's when I knew something unusual was happening. I had asked God for a particular way of communicating, and he had answered me. It became one of the ways I felt guided. Fast forward to after Hurricane Melissa came through. I didn't have internet for several weeks, so I started keeping a diary. And that little interruption in my internet service ended up revealing something else to me. I discovered that I was actually a much better writer than I was at speaking off the cuff. So I began asking God different questions. What should I share on YouTube? What do the people you are directing to my channel need to hear? And that's when the storytelling voiceover videos began. But let me take you back again, because there was another little piece of this story that I had almost forgotten. During the period when I was doing automatic writing for myself, there was a time when I heard in my spirit, you are an alchemist. Now, I had heard the word alchemist before, but if you had asked me what an alchemist actually was, I probably would have given you a blank stare. So naturally, I looked it up. I watched a few YouTube videos about alchemy, and for a while I even followed a woman whose channel was called The Alchemist. But as time passed, I stopped trying to figure out what being an alchemist had to do with me, my life, or my calling. I just put it on the shelf in my mind. And then about 2 years later, here I was, a volunteer at a charity giveaway in Newmarket, St Elizabeth. And there, sitting among all those books, was a book staring straight back at me. You know those moments when something catches your attention and you think, why am I noticing this? Well, this was one of those moments. The organisers had already told us that nothing was to be taken, and rightly so. The volunteers had already received a tremendous amount of blessings through the work we were doing, and these items were meant for the community. But something inside me said, pay attention. I've learned not to ignore those nudges, because sometimes what looks like a random moment is actually a divine appointment. So I went to one of the organisers and asked if I could have the book. She simply said, of course you can. The title? The Alchemist. Now tell me if that's not enough to make you pause. Out of all the books on that table, out of all the places I could have been that day, out of all the things I could have been doing, here was a book with the exact title connected to something I had heard in my spirit years earlier. And suddenly, something I had almost forgotten came rushing back to my memory. Maybe God had been leaving breadcrumbs all along, and perhaps this was simply another one. Sometimes we ask God for a sign, expecting fireworks, angels descending from heaven, or perhaps a loud voice with surround sound. But sometimes the answer is sitting quietly on a table in a church in St Elizabeth, waiting for you to notice it. And I noticed. I took the book. And little did I know that this wasn't just going to be another book I picked up and put on a shelf. It was about to become another chapter in a story God had been writing with me all along. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me bring you back to my thumb, because apparently even my body has decided it needs a sabbatical. I mentioned recently that I damaged my right thumb, and I believe the machiette work may have had something to do with it. The first joint clicks every time I try to straighten it, and one morning it decided to take things a step further and lock itself in a bent position. And let me tell you, trying to straighten a thumb that has apparently made up its mind is not fun. So I bought myself a thumb splint and decided that the outdoor work was officially on hold for now. My thumb had spoken and I was going to listen. I've also realised that I haven't had quite the energy I normally have. And then over the weekend I had no internet. But that's a whole other story, and we'll save that drama for another day. So with outdoor work temporarily suspended and the internet nowhere to be found, I picked up my new book. And this time something felt different. I felt a different kind of energy around it. I believe many of us don't recognise life-changing information when it first crosses our path. Sometimes the seed is planted long before we're ready to understand what it means. God can bring a person into our lives, place information in front of us, or allow us to experience a situation, and we may completely overlook its significance. But that doesn't necessarily mean the seed was wasted. Sometimes it simply needs time. It needs to be planted, watered, and given time to grow until we reach the point where we're finally ready to receive what it has been trying to teach us. And that's exactly what I believed happened with the word alchemist. When I first heard that I was an alchemist, I looked it up, watched a few videos, followed a woman whose channel was called The Alchemist, and then basically I said, "Okay, God, interesting," and I carried on with my life. The seed had been planted, but apparently I wasn't ready for the harvest. 2 years later, I'm standing at a charity giveaway in St. Elizabeth, and suddenly that same word appears in the form of a book sitting right in front of me, The Alchemist. Now I'm thinking, Lord, you're really not going to let this one go, are you? And that's when I began thinking about how often this happens in our lives. Something comes to us, but we're not ready for it. Then months or even years later, it comes around again, and suddenly the light comes on. Now I understand. And I believe that's part of our spiritual growth. God isn't always giving us new information. Sometimes He's bringing us back to information we've already encountered because we have now grown enough to understand it. But there's another side to this principle that we don't always like to talk about. If we don't learn the lessons life is trying to teach us, we can find ourselves repeating the same experiences over and over again. Different year, different circumstances, different faces, but somehow same story. And I know this one personally. Take my choice of men, for example. Looking back, I realised they all had the same spirit, just in different bodies. And because I wasn't learning the lesson, I kept repeating the pattern. Only each relationship seemed to get harder and worse. You would think after the first few rounds I'd have said, "Okay, Lord, I think I understand the assignment." But apparently I needed several remedial classes. And that's the thing about life. The lesson doesn't disappear simply because we refuse to learn it. Sometimes it gets louder. Sometimes the consequences become greater. Sometimes God allows us to reach that point where we finally say, "Enough, I have to do something differently." Because at some point we have to stop asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and start asking, "What am I supposed to learn from this?" And once we understand the lesson, we have to be willing to make the change, because nobody can break that pattern for us. Not God, not the pastor, guru, or other spiritual leader, not our family, not our friends, and certainly not the person we're hoping will suddenly change. We have to make the decision. And toxic relationships aren't limited to romantic relationships. Sometimes it's family, sometimes it's friendships, sometimes it's a business relationship, and sometimes, believe it or not, it may even be a job. You can spend years wondering why you're unhappy, exhausted, and unable to move forward, when the environment you're in and the people surrounding you are actually part of what's holding you back. Leaving doesn't always mean you failed. Sometimes leaving means you finally learn the lesson. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes it's growth. And perhaps that's another part of what this book was about to teach me. Because maybe The Alchemist wasn't simply placed in my hands to remind me of something I'd heard 2 years ago. Maybe it had arrived now because I was finally ready to understand it. And that got me thinking about what else in my life had been trying to get my attention. What seeds had already been planted and what was now ready to grow. So with no internet and my thumb making it very clear that land work was temporarily off the agenda, I found myself with something I don't always have enough of: time to sit still. And what better way to spend it than reading the book that had practically jumped off the table and into my hands. I read The Alchemist. And now that I've finished it, I believe there's something much deeper to the word alchemist than I first understood. In fact, I believe we are all alchemists. Now, before you start wondering if I've completely lost the plot, stay with me, because I certainly didn't understand this when I first heard the word 2 years ago. It has taken me 2 years, one very persistent word, one charity giveaway, one rather suspiciously well-placed book, and apparently a rebellious thumb to finally get it. But perhaps that's exactly how spiritual growth works. We are not always ready to understand something when it first comes to us. Sometimes the seed is planted and then life happens. We carry on, we forget about it, we move through different experiences, learn different lessons, make mistakes, grow, change, and then one day something we heard years ago suddenly makes sense. The seed has matured. And if you've listened this far, perhaps a seed has been sown in you too. Maybe you won't understand it all today. Maybe something I've said will simply sit quietly in the back of your mind. And that's okay, because I believe God knows exactly when the soil is ready. He knows when to plant the seed, He knows when to water it, and He knows when to bring the increase. And here's something I've come to understand. None of us has the power to stop what God has started. We may ignore it, we may resist it, we may take the scenic route, which, believe me, I have done more than once. But when something is truly part of our spiritual journey, God has a way of bringing it back around until we're finally ready to see it. So after 2 years of wondering what on earth God meant when He told me I was an alchemist, I finally picked up the book that seemed to have been waiting for me all along. So what exactly did I learn from The Alchemist, the book God placed in my hands? Well, the first thing that struck me was the idea that an alchemist is someone who understands nature and the world around them and sees the world as the visible expression of something spiritual. That really resonated with me. Because if the spiritual and material worlds are connected, then perhaps alchemy isn't some mysterious ancient practice reserved for people wearing robes and stirring strange things in enormous pots. Perhaps alchemy is something much more personal. Perhaps we're all alchemists. The book suggests that when we work on ourselves, when we strive to become better, wiser, more loving versions of who we are, everything around us is affected. And when I thought about that, I realised how true it is. When we become better, we don't just change ourselves, we change the way we see people. We change the way we respond to situations. We change the choices we make. And because of that, the world immediately around us begins to change too. And at the centre of that transformation is love. Because when we truly love, we naturally want to become better. We want to grow, we want to give, we want to understand, we want to become more than we were yesterday. The book speaks about the soul of the world, the idea that everything is connected, that the earth is alive in its own way, and that we are part of that greater soul. And for me, that connected beautifully with my own understanding of God. If the soul of the world is connected to the soul of God, and the soul of God is within us, then perhaps learning to understand the world around us is also part of learning to understand God. And that brought me to another powerful idea in the book. We all have a personal legend. Now, that phrase might sound a little grand. Personal legend sounds like something you should probably have a cape for. But essentially, it's about your true calling, the dream, purpose, or path that is uniquely yours. And the interesting thing is that many of us knew what that was when we were younger, before fear got involved, before other people's opinions got involved, before we started listening to all the reasons why we couldn't do something. Think about children. A child can say, "I want to be an astronaut," and nobody has to explain to them that the odds are against them. They simply believe it's possible. Then we grow up, and somewhere along the way, somebody says, "Be realistic." And unfortunately, many of us become very good at being realistic and very bad at following our hearts. We start living according to what other people expect from us. We become afraid of failure. Sometimes we're even afraid of success, because success means change, and change means stepping into territory we've never experienced before. So we stay where we are, not necessarily because we are happy there, but because at least it's familiar. And there's something strangely comforting about familiar misery. At least you know where everything is. But the book challenged that way of thinking. It reminded me that when we pursue something that is genuinely calling us from within, life can begin to open in ways we couldn't have predicted. That doesn't mean the journey will be easy, quite the opposite. In fact, the closer we get to what we are meant to become, the more we are tested. Our persistence is tested. Our courage is tested. Our faith is tested. And sometimes, just when we think we are finally getting somewhere, another obstacle appears and we think, "Seriously? Again?" And perhaps those obstacles aren't there simply to stop us. Perhaps they're there to prepare us. Because it's not enough to achieve the dream. We also have to become the person capable of carrying what we've been asking for. And that really spoke to me, because I've learned that sometimes God doesn't take us directly from point A to point B. We want a straight road. God gives us a scenic route. And if we are rushing forward, so determined to reach the destination, we can miss the signs along the way. We can miss the people we're supposed to meet, the lessons we're supposed to learn, the experiences that are preparing us, the little nudges that are saying, "Not that way, this way." And that's why I've become much more conscious of paying attention to the present. Because if we improve what is in front of us today, tomorrow has a better foundation to build upon. I've also learned that there is only one real way to learn, and that's through action. You can think about something forever. You can pray about it, you can research it, you can talk about it, you can watch 100 YouTube videos about it, but eventually you have to move. You have to take the first step. And that's where faith comes in. Because following your dream is a little like learning a new language. At first you won't understand everything. You'll make mistakes, you'll say things backwards, You'll probably embarrass yourself a few times, but if you keep going, eventually you start to understand. And perhaps that's what life is like. We learn by doing, we learn by falling, we learn by getting back up, we learn by listening, and we learn by paying attention. One of the ideas that really stayed with me was the importance of noticing where our hearts are most deeply moved. Were you brought to tears? What makes you feel something deep inside? What gives you that feeling that says this matters? Because perhaps that's where your treasure is. And wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart will be drawn. I've experienced that myself. There are things that have moved me to tears that I couldn't explain logically. There are people I've met and situations I've experienced that touch something deeper than my intellect. And looking back, I can see that some of those moments were pointing me towards something, towards purpose, toward growth, toward God. And perhaps that's why we should listen to our hearts. Because when we continually ignore that inner voice, it doesn't necessarily disappear. It keeps speaking, sometimes quietly, sometimes persistently. And sometimes it becomes so loud that you can no longer pretend you didn't hear it. I know that feeling. There have been times when I've tried to convince myself that I couldn't do something, shouldn't do something, or wasn't ready for something. But somewhere inside me, there was still that voice saying, but you know this isn't really what you want. And eventually, we have to be honest with ourselves. Because we can run from our circumstances, we can run from people, we can move to another country, but we cannot run away from ourselves. Eventually, the heart catches up with us. And I think one of the greatest fears we have is losing what we've already got. We're afraid to leave the familiar because we don't know what comes next. We're afraid that if we let go of the old, there may be nothing waiting for us. But perhaps that's where faith asks us to loosen our grip. Because if we believe that the same hand that has been writing our story is also holding the future, then maybe the unknown isn't quite as frightening as we imagined. And this is where I see the connection with my own journey so clearly. When I moved to Jamaica, I didn't know how everything was going to work out. I certainly didn't have the entire story written, but I took the step. And once I did, I entered a current that carried me into experiences I could never have imagined when I first made the decision. That's what happens when we make a genuine decision. Sometimes one decision changes the direction of your entire life. And then you look back years later and realise that the person who made that decision had no idea where it was going to lead. But perhaps they didn't need to know. Perhaps they simply needed enough courage to take the next step. And there's another thing I took from the book that really resonated with me. There's a treasure waiting for each of us. Not necessarily money, not necessarily possessions, but something within us that is uniquely ours. A gift, a purpose, a calling, a contribution that only we can make in our own particular way. And so many people never go looking for theirs because they're afraid. Afraid they'll fail, afraid they'll be judged, afraid they'll lose what they have, afraid they're not worthy, afraid they're dreaming too big. But here's the thing. The only thing that can make a dream truly impossible is the fear of failure. And perhaps that's why the journey matters just as much as the destination. Because every step toward the dream teaches us something. Every disappointment teaches us something. Every closed door teaches us something. Every wrong turn teaches us something. Even the relationships that broke our hearts can teach us something, if we're willing to learn the lesson rather than simply blame the other person and move on to repeat the same pattern with somebody else. And believe me, I know something about that one. Before the dream is realised, we are tested on everything we've learned along the way. And that may be the point. It's not simply about getting what we want, it's about becoming who we need to become in the process. Sometimes the darkest part of the night comes just before the dawn, and when we're in that darkness, we may think nothing is happening, but something is happening. We are being prepared, we're being transformed, we are becoming, and perhaps that is the real alchemy. Not turning ordinary metal into gold, but transforming ourselves, turning fear into courage, pain into wisdom, experience into understanding, loss into new beginnings, and dreams into something tangible. So when I look back at that book sitting on the table in Newmarket, I no longer see it as a coincidence. 2 years earlier, I heard the word alchemist and didn't understand it. 2 years later, the book found me. And perhaps the book found me at exactly the moment I was finally ready to understand what had been planted in me 2 years before. And that brings me right back to where I started. Maybe we really are all alchemists. Maybe we're all here to transform something. Maybe we're all carrying treasure within us that's waiting to be discovered. And maybe that thing you've been thinking about for years, the dream you keep pushing aside, the calling you keep ignoring, the change you know you need to make, isn't bothering you by accident. Maybe your heart keeps bringing it back because it's trying to lead you somewhere. So my question for you is, what is your personal legend? What is that thing your heart has never stopped talking about? And perhaps more importantly, what are you going to do about it? So let me bring you back to where this whole story began, the charity event. And before I do, I have to give a very special shout out to the Blues Boy Foundation. You have been a blessing in more ways than you probably realise. Not only have you provided practical and material help to people in communities across Jamaica, but somehow you've also become part of my own spiritual journey. Who knows how many lives have been touched through the work you've been doing over these 13 years. People have received clothing, shoes, food, school supplies and other necessities, but sometimes the blessing goes much deeper than the item being placed in someone's hands. Sometimes a simple act of giving restores someone's dignity. Sometimes it gives someone hope. And sometimes, as I've discovered, it can even put a book in the hands of someone who needed to read it. But while the overall event was a tremendous success, there was one incident at the church that was really disappointing. Now, the organisers have been doing this for 13 years, so they have learned a thing or two about how to make these giveaways work fairly. When I moved from the book section to help with the distribution of shoes and clothing, the leader explained the rules very clearly to every group that entered the room. I believe there were about 10 people allowed in at a time. Each person was told they could take no more than one pair of shoes and it had to fit them unless they were collecting for a child, and they were also allowed 2 suits of clothing. Once everyone had received their allowance, the floor would then be opened up and people could come back and choose whatever else they wanted. It was a very reasonable system, and everybody knew the rules. Even the shoes were carefully managed. Only one shoe from each pair was put on display. If someone found a shoe they liked and it fitted, we would then go and find its matching partner. So there was no confusion. But once the floor was opened and people were allowed to select what they wanted, there was one small complication. Because the clothing had been laid out on tarpaulin on the floor, people were reasonably asked to remove their shoes before walking around. Shortly afterwards, one of the women came to the team and said that her brand new crocs had disappeared. And these weren't the ordinary looking crocs either. These were the fashionable ones, and it was the first time she'd worn them. She was standing there barefoot, almost in tears, and honestly my heart went out to her. I don't like making judgments about people because none of us knows what is in the other person's heart. But I have to admit, I was somewhat surprised when the pastor suggested that we shouldn't judge the person who took them and that perhaps they had simply taken the shoes by mistake. Maybe, but I thought, well, that's a mighty big mistake to walk away with somebody else's shoes. An announcement was made immediately asking whoever had taken them to return them. But unfortunately, a thief doesn't normally hang around waiting for the consequences of their actions to catch up with them. And that's the sad part. There was absolutely no need for anyone to steal. Shoes were being given away. This wasn't a situation where somebody was taking something because there was nothing available to them. There was plenty. And yet, someone still chose to take something that belonged to another person. And whether that person realised it or not, their action has a consequence. They weren't simply taking a pair of shoes, they were taking away someone's dignity in that moment and leaving another human being standing there barefoot. To me, that's where the spiritual lesson comes in. We sometimes think our actions only affect us. They don't. Everything is connected. What we do to another person becomes part of the world we are creating. And if we are talking about becoming better versions of ourselves, if we're talking about the alchemy I was just telling you about, then this is where the rubber meets the road. It's easy to talk about spirituality. It's easy to talk about God. It's easy to say we love people, but the real test is how we treat people. Do we choose greed or compassion? Do we choose honesty or dishonesty? Do we see another person as someone whose well-being matters or simply as an obstacle between us and what we want? Thankfully, the story had a much happier ending. The organisers were able to provide a pair of sneakers for the woman, so her barefoot ordeal was quickly brought to an end. And I know she was grateful for that. Perhaps that was another little reminder that when another person takes something away, another person can choose to give. One action diminishes, another restores. And perhaps that is the kind of alchemy we should all be practicing. Apart from that unfortunate incident, the 3-day giveaway was a tremendous success. Honestly, if anyone left empty-handed, it was because they chose to. There was plenty for everyone. The organisers worked incredibly hard to make sure the communities were blessed, and it was wonderful to see people leaving with their hands full. And after all that work, the organisers even treated us volunteers to food at TFC, the rival to KFC, and told us to order whatever we wanted. Now, after spending the day giving to everybody else, hearing the words, "order whatever you want," was a blessing on another level. And so, as I bring this story to a close, I want to say once again, thank you Blues Boy Foundation, thank you for 13 years of service, thank you for the lives you've touched, thank you for the communities you've blessed, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. Little did you know that while I came to help give away books, clothing and shoes, I would walk away with something I believe was specifically meant for me. A book, a word, a reminder, a seed. And perhaps that's the beautiful thing about giving. You never really know where the blessing is going to land. You may think you're giving something to someone else only to discover that you were also receiving. So my prayer is that God will continue to bless the foundation, its organisers, volunteers, supporters, and everyone who makes this work possible. May the foundation continue to grow. May the reach become even wider. May more Jamaican communities be blessed. And may every hand that gives and every hand that receives be touched by something greater than the material gift itself. Because ultimately, it's not just about shoes, it's not just about clothes, it's not just about food or books. It's about people, it's about dignity, it's about compassion, it's about community. And it's about becoming the kind of people who leave the world a little better than we found it. And perhaps that's the greatest alchemy of all, turning what we have into a blessing for someone else. Thank you for coming along with me on this journey from Bethel Town to Newmarket, from a charity giveaway to a book called The Alchemist, and from a book to a deeper understanding of purpose, courage, love, and the journey we're all taking. If something I've shared today has spoken to you, don't dismiss it. Maybe it's a seed. Let it be planted, let it be watered. And when the time is right, perhaps you'll discover that it was growing inside you all along. Until next time, remember to listen to your heart, pay attention to the signs along the way, and never be afraid to take that step. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.
It was just a tease. We're women much out before you. Try to tease us with the AC, man. That was just